Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. And we are at the start of the 2045 offseason. Our Buffalo Wings were 162 during the regular season this year, the best record in baseball. And most importantly, we won our second consecutive World Series championship after falling behind in the World Series 2-0 to Toronto. Stormed back to win 4 in a row, 3 of them on the road, and then the clincher at home, as we sent hopeful future Hall of Famer Deshaun Seifu into retirement with a second consecutive World Series championship. As has become our habit, in this episode we're going to take a look at how our team performed in the regular season this year and start talking through our potential choices as far as the roster for this offseason. Just a final review of the statistics for the team. 100 wins, as I mentioned, but we definitely underperformed. Pythagorean formula suggests we should have been a 107-55 team. Couple weird months. October we had a losing record, but sample size of only one game, so that doesn't really count. For some reason, we were 500 in May, which was a little weird because we were over 600 every other month of the season. And a pretty incredible offensive and pitching combo this year. First in the National League with 822 runs scored. And you can see we were in the top handful in every offensive category except for home runs, where we were tied for 6th. Excellent running team, second in steals and first in base running. And the pitching, as it has been often in this playthrough, was outstanding. First in the National League in runs allowed, and we were first in every pitching category in the National League except for our bullpen ERA, where we were 4th, BABIP, where we were 4th, and strikeouts, where we were 4th. And we also had an excellent defensive team, 3rd in the National League in defensive efficiency and 1st in zone rating. So it really was a team that was firing on all cylinders, no obvious weaknesses. And it's sad to have to admit this, but the fact that we'll be moving on from an aging Deshaun Seifu, who was a mediocre platoon DH against left-handed pitching, and couldn't really offer much of anything in the field over these last couple years. And we're going to be likely able to replace him in the lineup with high potential youngsters like Arturo Casares, who is viewed as the number 2 prospect in baseball right now. Makes me think that a three-peat next year is not an impossible thought. But we've got a lot of decisions to make before we get to that point. And we're going to start talking through some of the early ones here in this episode. We'll take a look at our everyday players here first, and you can see the hole in the lineup from the retirement of Mr. Seifu earlier today. He will no longer be our leadoff hitter, a role that he's handled for most of the past 20 years. Another guy who likely won't be back is Luis Ortega, the top offensive catcher in baseball for over a decade at this point. We picked him up in a trade with the Phillies before the trade deadline, and he definitely provided a new dimension for our offense. 247 average and 10 homers and 146 at-bats, put up a 125 WRC plus, and definitely helped extend our lineup against right-handed pitching, which was important. Taking a look at the postseason, and Mr. Ortega did hit only a $186 with 1 home run, 56 WRC plus, 54 WRC plus. I need to put on my glasses. And he was basically just a replacement level player in the postseason. A little surprising, but we won the World Series, and he contributed to it. Taking a look at what he's looking for, over $30 million a year for 4 years, given that he's going to be turning 35 before next season starts. He is not in our plans for next year. Juan Ramirez, however, will be. Ended up hitting only .210 for us this year in 352 at-bats. Pretty poor offensive season with a 69 WRC plus, and disappointingly, you can see his WRC pluses have dropped 10 points a year each of the last 2 seasons. Still an excellent defensive catcher. Hope he'll provide a little more offense than he has. He'll be back with us next year, arbitration eligible. Again, going to be making around $6 million. Will likely be our starter unless we can find a more interesting alternative in free agency or the trade market. But Ramirez certainly will be back with us next year. A guy who will also be back with us next year, and we're hoping to get to see for a full season, is the first baseman Jim Reichert. This was supposed to be a glorious first year for him, and we're hoping he would be a shoo-in for National League Rookie of the Year. Unfortunately, he missed the first 3+ months of the season with a broken elbow. But when he came back, he was incredibly productive. 269 average, 22 homers, and 62 ribbies in just 275 at-bats with a 146 WRC plus. We anticipate that he will be batting in the middle of our order and most likely playing first base for us for the foreseeable future. Another guy that we're glad to have around is Ramiro Medina, arbitration eligible, and after the career he's started putting together, his arbitration numbers are starting to get quite high. Hit 282 this year with 24 homers and 73 ribbies. Did miss the first couple weeks of the season with an injury, but put up a 138 WRC plus when all was said and done. And his 6.4 WAR, I believe, was the best on our team, which is a bit surprising for a player who missed the first couple weeks of the season. Danny Ferguson, the third baseman, had a real slow start to the year, but ended up bouncing back and having a really nice season for us. 258 average, 32 doubles, 16 homers, drove in 84 runs, 109 WRC plus when all was said and done, 3.3 WAR. Not a superstar, but if a guy like Ferguson is batting 7th or 8th in your lineup, which you can see he bats 8th for us against right-handers, although he was in 7th against left-handers. If a guy like that is in the bottom third of your order, you're probably going to have a pretty decent offense. Steve Nickel is a guy we picked up to be a utility infielder for us right before the season started. Split time between AAA Albany and the majors, hit 250 and 84 at-bats in the major leagues. He's in the mix to maybe be a utility infielder again next year, but it's also conceivable he won't even be on the roster. Damani Essien traded for him about this time a year ago to be our bridge shortstop to Josh Fuchs. Josh Fuchs still not ready for the majors with his bat, and Damani Essien just opted into his contract for next year. So he'll be back as our shortstop next season, and hopefully we'll see a lot more of him than we did this year. He missed the first 4 months of the season with a broken elbow. That was a common injury for big-time players for us this year. And then he had 2 other stints on the injured list, including one that kept him out of the playoffs. He hit 326 for us. The issue is he only had 43 at-bats on the year. Not expecting that type of offensive production going forward from him. But if he's a competent offensive player with that glove, I think he could still be a pretty useful shortstop for us. He's won a lot of gold gloves over the course of his career. Jaheim Lawal is a guy we picked up right before the trade deadline, just on the fear that Essien might come back from his injury and not be what we thought he was going to be. Essien was what we thought he was going to be, but he ended up so banged up and injured that Lawal ended up our starting shortstop for most of the last couple months of the season, and was also our starter in the playoffs. Hit 277 in 130 at-bats for us, 82 WRC plus. Another guy with a good glove, headed to free agency, and he's looking for almost $20 million a year for 5 years. So given that we're not going to have a ton of money this offseason, and Essien has already opted into his contract, Lawal unlikely to be back. Mike Whitehead probably will finally be a utility infielder next year. He's been our starting shortstop off and on for parts of the last couple seasons and has been a starter for us for a good chunk of his career. 93 WRC plus this year, hit 252, 21 doubles, 10 homers, 63 ribbies. So a respectable offensive season for a guy who can competently play a number of positions in the infield. The fans love him. His arbitration number is getting a bit high at over $5 million for a guy that we envision being a utility infielder next year, because Reichert, Medina, Ferguson, and Essien should be our starters. But with the injury issues we've had with Essien, probably leaning towards trying to bring Whitehead back as one of our utility infielders for the 2046 season. And before we finish up with our position players, we've got to talk about our outfielders, and this is an area that has become an embarrassment of riches for us. We'll be talking about some of the prospects in our next episode, but we've got a lot of outfield talent at this point and a lot more on the way. Tim Boston, in his second year with us, was not quite as productive as a year ago. Hit 267, 37 doubles, 16 homers, 76 ribbies. Added up to a 115 WRC plus. He's a good, solid player, and he's still going to be making the major league minimum next year, so he will likely be back with us again. But honestly, even with the skill he has, certainly no guarantees that he's going to be one of our 5 outfielders when all is said and done. A guy we'll probably be moving on from is Edgar Canales, another left-hander who's come up in our system. Hit 287 in 303 at-bats, 113 WRC plus, 16 of 18 stealing bases, competent defensively, but he's fragile physically, and he is now out of option years and arbitration eligible, so he's going to be making about $2.5 million next year. To me, it's conceivable that we look to deal him in the offseason rather than offering him arbitration, since we're going to have a lot of competition in the outfield, and particularly a guy who doesn't have any option years left is going to be tricky for us to keep. Juan Larios on many teams would be a prized outfield prospect. For us, he's a guy who I think is going to probably struggle to stick with the team as a 4th or 5th outfielder. Hit 267 in 281 at-bats with a big club this year, 23 doubles, 10 homers, 115 WRC plus. Another guy who's got a little bit of speed. He's durable, solid left-handed hitter. The type of guy that most teams would be looking to think about building around. And as I mentioned, next year there's not even a guarantee that he'll be on the 26-man roster. Part of the reason he may not be is Arturo Casares, listed as the number 2 prospect in baseball right now. And this is a guy who was an international free agent signing for us, closing in on 5 years ago. And he has just had some meteoric talent change randomness over the last couple of years. You can see when the 2044 season started, he was 30 in terms of his contact, and we thought he had 55 potential. Now he's 60 in terms of his contact with 70 potential. Power, incredible growth in terms of his rating and his potential. His eye kind of is what it is, but that combination of just wacky, insane, rapid growth in both his ability to make contact and his ability to hit the ball an incredible distance has led him to be a top prospect for us. We did bring him up in the playoffs, and he performed fine for us, making his major league debut under a lot of pressure in the NLDS, NLCS, and the World Series. Hit 250 with 2 homers in his first 32 major league at-bats, 109 WRC plus. But it was not really about what he did in that cup of coffee in the month of October with us that has us so excited. It's the fact that he put up a ridiculous 69 home runs with 141 ribbies across 3 levels this year, 178, 201, and 185 WRC pluses, combined for an 8 WAR across those 3 levels of the minor leagues. Just an incredible season. Has excellent outfield range, good speed, good bunter. Really, the only thing he seems that he can't do is draw a lot of walks, and he could still get to a pretty competentish level at that, at least according to our scouts. So Casares is certainly going to be getting some playing time, and he could be pressuring Ishmael Velasco to become our starting center fielder, which is crazy to think about because Velasco is a guy that we really like. The fans love him. Another guy with good speed, durable, competent defensive center fielder, and a decent bat. Had a pretty prototypical Ishmael Velasco season this year. 276 average, 20 homers, 80 ribbies, 33 doubles, 29 stolen bases with just 3 caught stealings, 119 WRC plus, and a 3.8 WAR. He's a guy that we signed to a long-term contract years ago at the very early stages of his contract. He's making good money now, and you could make an argument that maybe he should be one of the odd men out in this outfield. But the reason I will never at least consider doing that this upcoming year, well, I won't consider doing it this upcoming year, and I'll probably never consider doing it because Velasco thus far has proven to be an incredible postseason player. We've won 3 World Series championships. He's only 28 years old, and he is a 3-time World Series MVP and also won a Divisional Series MVP for us in 2042. You look at his career batting stats with that 118 WRC plus for the course of his career, Rookie of the Year and an All-Star his first season. And he's a very strong offensive player with a good glove. But then you look at what he's done in the postseason, and 131 WRC plus over the course of his postseason career, batting over 300, and the most ridiculous stat for the 28-year-old Mr. Ishmael Velasco, and we've went over some pretty ridiculous postseason stats in our last episode when we recapped Deshaun Seifu's career. But at the age of just 28 years old, Ishmael Velasco at this point has 26 career doubles in the postseason. He is just an extra base hitting machine. 850 OPS plus, 850 OPS, 132 OPS plus. Has proven to be a pretty clutch player throughout the playoffs over the course of his career, and he's been his best when the lights are the brightest in the World Series. So glad to have him back on the team again next year. Another guy who will likely be fighting for a roster spot despite a really interesting hitting profile is Jamari Habersham. Probably the most similar profile to Deshaun Seifu we've had on our team ever since Seifu first joined. Not quite as good as Seifu, a worse eye than Seifu, and his contact and gap power and even his speed and his stealing ratings aren't quite as high as the brilliant ratings that Seifu had in his prime. But a left-handed hitting outfielder, competent defensively, hit just 261 for us in 222 at-bats, but did have 12 doubles, 6 triples, only a 79 WRC plus for us. But over the course of his rather brief major league career, he's been an above-average offensive player overall. Certainly, as a guy who is still going to be making the major league minimum next year, merits some consideration. And, when you start looking at the depth here, Boston making the major league minimum, Lario still with options, Habersham making the major league minimum, Velasco, 3-time World Series MVP, Casares, one of the top prospects in baseball. You can start to see why a guy like Edgar Canales, who's out of options and going to be making $2.5 million next year, is likely someone we'll look to trade this offseason. And last but not least, Josh Porter, a guy who's kind of been in and out of our lineup over the several years he's been with us now. Really got a full year this year, and he was incredibly productive for us. Hit 283, 31 doubles, 25 homers, team best 104 ribbies, also stole 28 bases, added up to a 139 WRC plus and a 5.6 WAR. He's got some speed, as we talked about, with the stolen bases. He's got good range in the outfield. Making real money now after we signed him as a free agent, or before he hit free agency before last season, but he's been a member of our last 3 World Championship teams. No guarantees that he'll be back with us, just because it's such an embarrassment of riches in the outfield. And as I said, I haven't even talked about 2 or 3 other guys in the minors who are knocking on the door of being ready for the majors. It's crazy to think that you might look to move on from a guy like a Porter, but it's not entirely inconceivable. And with the review of our position players over, we'll turn to our outstanding pitching staff. And Jim Lance is a guy who came up through our farm system, second-round pick 9 years ago in 2036. And think he may, although he's never been an all-star in his career, he is now a 3-time Major League champion, and we think he may finally get some respect. Would have to view him as a very strong candidate for the Cy Young Award this year. Led the National League with 18 wins, a 2.02 ERA, 2 walks per 9 innings, a 58 FIP minus, a 6.7 WAR, and perhaps most impressively, he led the National League in WHIP for a 3rd consecutive season. Throws in the high 90s, has an outstanding fastball, an excellent sinker, and a well above average slider. Good movement on his pitches, above average control. He is the definition of an ace. Headed into his last arbitration eligible year, set to make about $20 million. We've visited contracts and long-term contracts with him every offseason, but he has known his value basically ever since he came up. Taking a look at it right now, you can see if we say that we want to sign him for 8 years, he's looking for over $40 million a season. So we are going to enjoy the discount of paying him arbitration money this year, even if it's $18, $19, $20 million. It's a fraction of what he's worth if he's healthy. And we'll deal with the crazy money that he's potentially looking for a year from now. Would certainly love him to be a long-term member of this team. With the money he's looking for, it may be tricky to execute on. Alexis Barajas is a former Cy Young Award winner for us in 2036. Interestingly, the same year that we drafted Jim Lance. He's now our number 2 starter, 12-9 this year with a 3.48 ERA. He's an Iron Man as far as his injury proneness. His velocity, I believe, has dipped a bit, but not incredibly. 93 to 95 was his peak, so it's only dipped this past year just a mile per hour. He is 37 years old now. His ratings are still sound. We've got him signed for another 2 years at $22 million, and then a team option for his age 39 season. Hopefully, he'll continue to be real productive the next couple years and won't fall off a cliff in terms of his abilities, because he's a real nice number 2 behind Lance. Jim Coles was a first-round pick in 2041. And he had an outstanding rookie year for us, 15-6 with a 3.50 ERA, 3.4 WAR. Would have to think that he's going to get some votes for Rookie of the Year. Has a really nice 5-pitch arsenal. None of the pitches are outstanding, but they're all above average and well above average. Captain personality, good influence in the clubhouse. Not an ace, but if he is your number 3 starter, as he is with us, you're feeling pretty good about your team. Chris Lott, 27-year-old, another first-round draft pick. We have gone heavy with the drafting of the pitchers in our typical spot picking in the 30s and early 40s with supplemental picks in these drafts, and it's definitely worked out for us. Lott, quite honestly, is a very similar profile to Mr. Coles that we were just talking about. 5 pitches, probably not quite as high end, but as I said, 17-11 record, the ERA 4.20. He had some rough outings over the last month or two of the season. 2.2 WAR. A guy who is finally going to start being arbitration eligible this coming year, making around $3 million, but still a pretty good value as a number 4 pitcher. And last but not least, Simeon Manelli. Very low stamina, but he's got a 4-pitch arsenal, and we've used him as our number 5 starter. He's just a 5-inning guy for us, so he doesn't get a ton of decisions. 9-7 this year, but a 3.22 ERA, 128 ERA plus, 88 FIP minus. He's a guy that we signed to a very reasonable long-term contract a few years ago, since it's unclear if his long-term future is as a starter or a reliever. Right now, a guy like him as a number 5 starter is a pretty good bargain for us. We'll get into some of our middle and long relievers right now. Mike Roberts, a guy who was a 7th-round pick out of Coastal Carolina 6 years ago, been up and down the last couple years, was not great this year with a 5.72 ERA over 28 1/3 innings. But you look at his ratings, and you look at the fact that he's still making the major league minimum. He's probably going to be a member of the back end of our bullpen next year. Chris Powers we may be done with, though. 32-year-old former Rule 5 pick out of the Dodgers. Split time between Buffalo and Albany this year. Was pretty bad with the big club with an 8.25 ERA. Still has solid ratings, but he's going to start making more than the major league minimum. The reason we might keep him around is he still does have 1 option year left. If you've got a guy like this in AAA who could start or relieve, admittedly, with that 35 stamina, he's a 4 or 5 inning starter, but he does have a 3-pitch arsenal, popular with the fans, Iron Man as far as his injury proneness. If you can stash a guy like that in AAA, which is not inconceivable for us, despite the fact he's coming off of a rough year, I think there's some value there. Joe Warner is another guy whose roster spot is probably in jeopardy. The 33-year-old lefty is out of option years, and he is going to start making more than the major league minimum next year. He is a respectable left-handed reliever, 3.44 ERA for us over 70 2/3 innings, but not having options unless we're sure that he's going to be on the major league roster. We may look to move on from him this offseason. Part of the reason we may move on from him is that we'll have Kevin Hale back. Hale also out of option years, and his season was not as good as Warner's with a 4.46 ERA over 70 2/3 innings. But when we look at the ratings here, Hale is very tough on lefties, and that to me is the reason why I think it's more likely he'll be back with us next year than Warner, because although Warner is tougher on lefties than he is on righties, his stuff is just not really special against lefties. So I think if we're looking for a guy to be a specialist out of the pen, I prefer what Hale brings to the table with that outstanding slider and sinker that are pretty tough against left-handed batters. And Luis Palencia is kind of the bullpen version of Simeon Manelli, a guy who we signed to a long-term deal, a guy with a 4-pitch arsenal, not tons of stamina, but can start if we need him to. 3-5 this year with 5 saves. The 4.73 ERA over 64 2/3 innings was not particularly impressive. Not even a full win above replacement in terms of what he did for us. but the fans like him. We have him signed to a very reasonable long-term deal. And as I noted, he's a guy who could start for us in a pinch. So as a sixth or seventh arm out of the bullpen, Palencia, I think, is still a pretty nice guy to keep around. And now we will talk about our top 5 pitchers out of our bullpen. And the reason we're going to talk about these top 5 pitchers is because although I envision all 5 of our starters being back next year, it's conceivable that none of these 5 players could be back with us next year. Now, that won't actually happen, but they are all either eligible for free agency or in a situation where we've got a team option to think about with them. And with the money some of these guys are making, as much as we like these top 5 guys out of our bullpen, it's probably going to be 3 of them at most that are going to be back with us next year. And among those top relievers, we'll start with the 2 older guys first. Nate Ruckel has been an important part of our bullpen for many years at this point. 3 world championships with us, in addition to 1 in the early stages of his career with the Red Sox. Was our stopper for 4 seasons and was incredibly good in that role after he replaced Lorne Walborn. Ruckel has since been replaced in the stopper role by Floyd Auclair, but he's still been a real important pitcher for us the last 3 years. 1.60 ERA over 62 innings pitched out of the bullpen this year. He's a bit more effective against lefties than he is against righties. We've got a team option for $2 million for him next season. A little concerned at this point that his stuff is only average, but he'll also be 38 years old in just a couple of weeks. But still think with the fact that he is better against lefties than he is against righties, even if we end up using him as a lefty specialist for $2 million, with the performance he's had over the course of his career, it's hard to imagine that all of a sudden he's just not going to magically be a good pitcher next year. So I think, especially given that he's making the least out of these 5 guys, he's the one who almost certainly will be back with us next year, although we have not officially exercised that option yet. We picked up David Rivera from the Rockies before the trade deadline. Rivera, as you may remember, was with us for a couple of years, a couple seasons ago, and we traded him away in a very big trade for the, at the time, top prospect Brenton Burrill, when the Rockies really wanted to pick up Rivera. And then Burrill is who, with many others, we ended up turning into, or not with many others, but with another top prospect, is who we ended up turning into Jim Riker. So it was very valuable for us to trade him away in his early to mid-30s. He did come back to us this year in a trade in July, and he was outstanding with a 0.96 ERA over 28 innings pitched. Ridiculous 4.28 ERA plus. Still a very competent right-handed reliever. Iron Man as far as his injury proneness, although he is 35 years old at this point. We've got a team option for him next year. It's $6.4 million. And that's the only question, because $6.4 million, if we use him as a closer or a stopper, is probably not unreasonable for a pitcher of his quality. But if we're only going to use him as a setup man or a middle reliever, which is conceivable given the depth of our bullpen, $6.4 million is a lot, especially when you think about the next 3 guys we're going to talk about, who are all better than Rivera and looking for more money or due to get paid more money than Rivera. Floyd Auclair is finally eligible for free agency, so we've got a big decision to make on him. He has been an outstanding stopper for us the last 3 years, led the league in games pitched and holds each of those 3 years, pitching about 140 innings a year, 276 ERA this year with 193 strikeouts. I mean, the guy is averaging over 200 strikeouts a year for us the past 3 seasons working out of the bullpen. 149 ERA plus, 57 FIP minus. He won the Mariano Rivera Award a year ago and will probably get some votes again this year. Stuff is off the charts. Movement is off the charts. He does walk a fair amount of batters, but you can't quibble with what the ultimate results are. He is due to become a free agent, and he's looking for 4 years at about $13 million a season. Would certainly love to have him back and think with the money he's looking for, if we can make it work, willing to pay that money for a guy who's going to be pitching 130, 140 plus innings for us out of the bullpen. Joe Scott, we re-signed to be our closer a couple of years ago. And it was a 4-year deal, but the final 2 years were team options. So we've got a team option on him for $12 million next year. His stuff is excellent, movement above average, solid control. But he is going to be 31 soon. He's fragile in terms of his injury proneness, and he's coming off of probably his worst season with us. And that was still a solid year. 7 wins, 34 saves, 81 strikeouts and 65 1/3 innings, 2.74 Sierra, but his WAR was below 1, and he isn't always the best in the clubhouse with his low leadership and his low loyalty, and the fragility has been an issue in the past. He has been banged up at times, and his postseason career has generally been really solid with us. He set a single season record with 7 saves in the postseason a year ago. But this year he was pretty rough. He did have 4 saves, but an 0-2 record, lost games for us in both the NLDS and the NLCS, and put up a 6.48 ERA. Now, it's an 8 1/3 innings sample size, and he gave up 3 runs in those 8 1/3 innings, so that explains a lot of it. But you look at how he's rated at 31 years old and fragile and due to make $12 million. And then you look at the guy that we picked up before the trade deadline, 2 years younger, same kind of stuff, much better control, durable physically, throws harder, better in the clubhouse. And McClintock was much better for us in the playoffs this year, too, with a 1.23 ERA. He's only been with us over a small sample size, but a 1.78 ERA over the 25 1/3 innings that he pitched for us this year. And I think when I think about these two players, if we're going to have one back as our closer next year, to me, McClintock is the guy. As I said, he's almost exactly 2 years younger. He's durable rather than fragile. Same kind of stuff, slightly worse movement, but much better control. They're both 2-pitch guys. Fastball cutter for Scott, fastball slider for McClintock. And we've got the option to, as I said, move on from Joe Scott since he is in a team option year for us. So I did talk to Mr. McClintock, and he was looking for 4 years at $13.3 million a season. And we've made an offer to him, and quite honestly, it's the exact same contract that we signed Joe Scott to a couple of years ago. That contract with Scott was $10 million the first year, 11 in the second, and then team options for 12 and 13 million in the third and fourth seasons. And although he was asking for more money, McClintock was willing to consider that exact offer. So we've got that $46 million offer over 4 years out to McClintock. I just think, as I said, he's younger. He's more durable. He's better in the clubhouse. And he's a little bit better in terms of his ratings than Joe Scott. To be able to potentially bring him back for the same money that we were basically paying Scott and potentially opt out of Scott's contract seems to me like a decision I have to make, even though Scott is a 3-time world champion with us, a 5-time All-Star, and a 2-time Mariano Rivera Award winner. He's been fantastic with us, but I think McClintock is better right now. So then the question is, if we're going to bring McClintock back as our closer and probably bring back Ruckel as a middle reliever lefty specialist for us, what do we do with Scott, who's due to make $12 million, Auclair, who's looking for $13 million a year over 4 years, and Rivera, who's due to make $6.4 million? And right now, what I think I'm leaning towards doing is making an offer to Auclair. I think I can probably sign him for $11.5, $12 million. Don't know whether he'll go for the same type of optionality as McClintock, but Auclair is a weapon, and he's the youngest of the three. I struggle a little bit with paying two guys out of the bullpen $11.5, $12, $12.5, $13 million each. But the thought is, with McClintock as a closer and Auclair back as a stopper, that is a bullpen in the 7th, 8th, 9th innings that nobody can compete with. And the fact that we basically got a very cheap option to get out of Scott's contract by just paying him $1.2 million makes me think that although Scott has been our closer for many years and has been exceptional in that role, having McClintock and Auclair back next year makes more sense. And if we're going to be spending a combined $22, $23 million on Auclair and McClintock, I think we probably don't bring Rivera back at $6.4 million. So I think at this point, what I'm leaning towards doing is shopping Joe Scott and David Rivera and just seeing what type of trade value they might have. If there's some trade value there, we trade them away and let the other team deal with their option. If there's no trade value, perhaps we decline both of those options and focus our attention on bringing back McClintock, Auclair, and likely Ruckel. Take a quick look at what's available initially on the trade market, and I haven't looked at these guys yet. Don't know that I really want a veteran, but we'll take a quick look at least. And Rivera, you can see we can get back some guys making a lot of money in return. But there's probably some players to at least investigate on this list. We can get something back of some small level of use. Chris Laney is a starter with the Rockies. And I don't know why my computer is so slow. Yeah, he's a pretty solid starter, right-hander. He's got $21 million a year for the next 2 years and then a team option, and he's fragile physically. He'd certainly be an upgrade over some of the guys at the back end of our rotation. Love the fact that he's a captain personality and think he'd likely be a lot more effective pitching in Buffalo than in Colorado. But we would probably need them to keep a good chunk of his contract because it's just not a huge need of ours. Luis Medina, 25-year-old, good, solid reliever. I don't know that he's worth $4.2 million though. So I'm not overwhelmed with the options available for David Rivera, but again, I haven't spent much time at them either. I would tend to think that there would be a little more value potentially for Joe Scott, even though he's making more money. He's younger, and he's certainly a higher end pitcher at this point than Rivera is. We'll see what the offers look like for Joe Scott. And it's kind of similar. Actually, with Joe Scott, it's more you have to take a contract back in return. It actually looks like, again, had a very high level of quick analysis. It's a deeper pool of players that we can get for Scott, but I think some of the players that we could actually get for Rivera were maybe more interesting. So no one seems incredibly anxious to take on that contract. Our old buddy Isidro Ochoa, we could bring him back. He's making pretty good money, but he is still a starter at this point. Fragile physically, though. So it doesn't look like we're going to get any monsters back for these guys. And some of the better players are these veterans with contracts in the 15, 18, $20 million range, which isn't really what we're looking to do, particularly for an outfielder. You know, if there was a established veteran catcher that we could maybe pair up with Ramirez that we could get for one of these guys, that might be something that would make sense for us to do, and probably something for me to explore a bit offline. Mike James, solid closer for the Braves, making a bit less money than Scott is, but if the whole point of getting rid of Scott is to pay the high-end money to McClintock and to Auclair, doesn't really make sense to take back another closer who's making 90% of what Scott is making or set to make. So I think I'm going to explore offline maybe some more creative options of what we could do if we did decide to trade away Scott and or Rivera. And as I mentioned, as far as the position players, there's guys like Nickel and Whitehead and Canales and Habersham and maybe even a Larios or a Porter or a Boston who could conceivably end up being used in a trade as well. So I've got a lot of things to think about. If you've got thoughts on what we should and should not do, let me know. Still have a whole nother episode before we start simming forward from this first day of the off season, where we'll be visiting in on our farm system and talk about some of the big prospects we have coming. We've got outfielders and some solid pitchers on the way, which certainly help. And then we'll also take a look at how some of our top former players performed around the league this year. And then the decision-making will begin. So if you've got thoughts on what we should do with Scott and Rivera, would appreciate those. But as I've said, we've made an offer to McClintock, and I'm actually going to make an offer to Auclair. Actually, I can't make an offer to Auclair right now because with the offer to McClintock that I've made, you can see we've only got $2.2 million available at this point unless I start pulling money out of scouting and player development, which I guess I could. But the point is to get Scott off the books, and then that alone will open up the money that we need to go after Mr. Auclair. But because I do want to bring back Auclair, I'm going to try to get a contract off to him right now. 4 years, $13 million, wants a player option in that final year. So actually it is very similar to what McClintock was asking for. He was actually asking for 4 years, $13.3 million with a player option in the fourth year. And we got him to agree to those team options in the third and fourth seasons in less money. With Auclair being younger, I might try to offer him a 5-year deal just to do something different. I'll let you know what I come up with. And the offer we made McClintock was 4 years at an average of $11.5 million a year with team options for the final 2 seasons. So we're going to try, at least with our initial offer to Auclair, to be a little bit less money. 5 years at an average of $11 million a year with team options for the 4th and 5th seasons. Because he was looking for slightly less money than McClintock was, and he's also not insistent on being a closer. We're going to at least put this offer out there. It certainly isn't an offer that's going to end negotiations, and there's a chance he might just accept this as it is. And he's willing to think about it. So again, having 2 players with 8-figure-a-year contracts out of the bullpen is a lot to be paying, but these Buffalo Wings have developed into a more well-financed franchise than we were 20-plus seasons ago when we started this, and we can kind of afford to do it. So we're going to submit that offer, 5 years, $55 million to Auclair. So we've got big offers out at this point, over $100 million combined, to have Auclair and McClintock as our stopper and closer for the next at least 2 and possibly 4 to 5 years. And what that pretty much means with those 2 offers out there is that we will not be exercising our team option for $12 million next year on Joe Scott, because we would have both McClintock and Auclair back for less money next season than we would be paying to Scott. So I'm going to need to get creative offline and see if maybe there's something interesting we can do in a trade with Scott. Would rather get something back in return, would rather not have to pay the $1.2 million buyout. And as I said, if there's a catcher that we could team up with Ramirez, that's kind of the only area that we feel like we really need to address as far as our position players, because with Reichert, Medina, Ferguson, and Essien, we love our starting infield. And as we talked about, we've got at least 2 too many outfielders at this point, and we may have 3 or 4 outfielders too many with the help that we have on the way in AA and AAA. So I don't want to say it's an embarrassment of riches, but I feel really good about where the team is with the talent level we have this year. As I mentioned, the budget much better than it's ever been, except for last year, since we did get that small dip this year. But at $254 million, I don't think it's irresponsible to be paying what we're trying to pay McClintock and Auclair, given that we view them as 2 premier arms for the bullpen. So if you've got thoughts on what we're starting to do, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, would love to hear them in the comments down below. And we'll be back in our next episode with a look at our farm system, some of that additional talent that's on the way, and we'll check in on some of our former players as well. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.